I taught for years courses on amateur media, and he featured very prominently in the classes that I taught, in part because you can sort of teach the history of home movie making, although at a very high level, through his films and the films that have been made available. And David and Kimberly this evening are going to tell us a little bit about kind of his craft and about the sort of way in which over the years and through the decades, Robbins Barstow sort of flexed to accommodate the changes in sort of home movie making, both technologically and otherwise. So please help me introduce Kimberly and David Barstow.
You all set?
I think so.
Well, thank you all for having us. It is my father's 100th year. He was born in 1919, and for 75 of those years, he had a big hobby of making home movies. He started using 16 millimeter black and white films in the mid-30s, black and white through the 30s and 40s. In the 50s, he started using color 16 millimeter film. And he used the color 16 millimeter until the mid-80s, when he switched over to using Super 8 for a little while. So perhaps you'll have a chance to use some of his films in your project. And then he went on to use VHS videotape through most of the 90s and the 2000s. But he never made the switch to digital. He never had a smartphone, and he never edited any films on his computer. So I remember a conversation I had with him, I think it was in 2008. My brother, Dan, my sister, Cedar, and I were trying to convince my parents that it was time to move to a senior living out of the home that we'd lived in for almost 60 years. We knew it was a really wise idea. They were in their 80s, late 80s, but Dad was really worried about his hobby. His home movie making hobby. Our home in Wethersfield, Connecticut had this huge, huge room that was basically his movie studio. He had closets that were stacked high with reels of film. And he had a great big table, like that big, that had his editing equipment on, the little wheels you roll around and the things you cut and splice with. And he just wondered how that was going to work in a much smaller apartment. So I said, it's easy, Dad, just go digital. And I explained that all of those films on the reels would fit in a hard disk like about so big, right? And that the editing you could do just by pressing buttons on a computer. And he looked at me and said, now how big is that digital thing? I said, about like so. And I thought I had him, because I think he was thinking about it, but he just couldn't do it, because so much of his process was in the style and the constraints of film and the way he grew up, that it would have been an incredible change in his style of operation to go digital. And so I felt really frustrated. And I think that's the way my granddaughter feels when she tries to teach me how to do something on my smartphone. But in the end, my dad was wise enough to say, yeah, I guess we'd better move. And a couple years later, they moved to Avery Heights in Hartford, but my father's health was declining. So although we set up his table in the second apartment, in the second bedroom in the apartment, he never really got to take advantage of it. So Dad was a filmmaker of the pre-digital era. And Kim, why don't you take over?
Thanks so much. It's really been such a great pleasure to work with Robin's son, Dave, and collaborate on this presentation and learn a lot about Robbins Barstow in the process as well. So many of you in this room had an opportunity to meet Robbins Barstow at some point, and I imagine that many of you are familiar with him. But for those of you who aren't, I'm going to provide a brief biographical kind of overview and tell you a little bit about how Dave and I came to collaborate today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how New York University Libraries acquired some of Robbins Barstow's films in 2008. But before we get there, I'd like to go back and talk about the beginning. So being that we're at Northeast Historic Film today, I want to center us on the New England area, and which was very much Robbins Barstow's region. So Robbins Barstow was born 100 years ago in Woodstock, Vermont, and he spent his childhood mostly in Hartford, Connecticut. His family lived in Madison, Wisconsin for a bit, but relocated to Hartford at the age of 11. And Robbins' father was a third-generation minister, and his mother a homemaker, raising Robbins and his two brothers. Robbins was a lifelong educator, civil rights activist, pacifist, environmentalist, and he strongly believed that movies could be a positive force in our society. He graduated from Dartmouth College and received his PhD in educational administration. He ultimately made his home with his wife, Meg, and their 3 children, including Dave, in Wethersfield, Connecticut. I had the pleasure of first meeting Robbins Barstow at the EMEA conference that many of you probably attended in Rochester, New York, 2007, I believe. Robbins was really excited to be welcomed into the film archiving community, felt as if he had found his people, and that we really appreciated his amateur filmmaking, which for those of you who have not had the chance to see his films, you'll get a chance to get a taste of today. So I look back with great fondness of our conversations and talking about his filmmaking, and I know that he was thrilled by the idea that his home movies might achieve what he said was, quote, immortality. So, some of this may be a recap for folks in this room, but we're knowing that there's individuals of varying backgrounds. We're also recording the session so that we might be able to use some of this for Robbins Centennial, which is upcoming in October. So broadly speaking, when Robbins moved to Hartford, he obtained his 16 millimeter projector. It was a small hand-cranked Kodascope on which he was able to project commercially produced 16 millimeter films. And he actually got the 25-foot reels of short films, of cartoons and comedies, and he actually charged his neighbors a nickel or a dime to come see films, which he would project on a white sheet in his home, in the basement. 2 years later, inspired by his neighbors and their filmmaking endeavors, the neighborhood kids, he purchased a 16 millimeter camera. The camera itself was a die-cast aluminum box measuring, about 8 by 8 by 4.5 inches, weighed about 7 pounds. He continued to make films enthusiastically over the next 7 decades. In total, Barstow made and edited about 50 home movies and amateur films. Most of them were silent, although he did narrate the films when he exhibited them. When he screened them silently, he would often accompany it by narration. And so the technology of the day, he used 16 millimeter film in his most of the decades of his filmmaking. It was introduced in 1923, roughly half the size of 35 millimeter theatrical film stock. The film was not only less than half the width of conventional 35, but approximately 1/6 of the cost. 16 millimeter acetate safety film underwent a process of direct film reversal. The reversal film process represented a stark change from the traditional process of negative and positive films, which required 2 separate film strips. The reversal process introduced a new principle because the film that was exposed in the camera was then developed as a negative and reversed. This method shortens the developing process by 1 step, saving both time and, most importantly, money. Duplicates can be made from the print, but the cost associated with that for amateur filmmakers was much less common. So the 4 16 millimeter silent films that New York University acquired were all camera original reversal films. Hartford, Connecticut, in the 30s and 40s, Robbins Barstow was a self-proclaimed movie buff, and he became a member of the Amateur Cinema League as a youth. The International League was founded in 1926, and coincidentally, its founder, Hiram Percy Maxim, was living in Hartford, Connecticut. When Robbins was a youth, he volunteered to write film reviews for the Hartford Courant so he could get into theaters and watch movies for free. He took advantage of that, and he watched as many movies as he could. And as Dave recently discovered, he even recorded in his diary the name of every movie he saw, where he saw it, and who he actually saw it with. Dave also remembers from his childhood that their house was filled with books about movies, and his father's love of film was quite evident. We're fortunate that Robbins had what he described as, quote, irresistible impulses to record and preserve moving images of life around me, which was a quote from an interview in 2008 that was done with him when he attended the Orphan Film Symposium in New York City. We are all the richer as a result. The Amateur Cinema League released a statement of its objectives in the first issue of its official magazine, Movie Makers, most of which focused on the need to advise, assist in, and advocate for non-professional production. Included in these were, for example, pledges to, quote, increase the pleasure of making home motion pictures by aiding amateurs to originate and produce their own plays, end quote, and, quote, promote amateur cinematography as a national sport. To this end, in addition to their magazine, Movie Makers, the ACL also published books and short manuals advising the amateur on various technical matters. Robbins perused the magazine to learn tricks about titling, editing, and developing new and innovative cinematographic approaches. Learning from the community of amateur filmmakers, Robbins read a lot about making home movies, including trick shots like reverse motion and stop motion. He also maintained a small Kodak editing and titling machine so he could edit and title his films for home screening. So Dave and I are going to jump back and forth. Dave's up now.
Thank you, Kim. We're going to illustrate Dad's craft through looking at several of the films that he made. The first one we're going to look at is Tarzan and the Rocky Gorge. I know this is a film that some of you are familiar with. I think it was in 2005 at this symposium where he presented and talked about the film. This was actually the only film that Dad made that was an imagined story. He made it in 1936. He and his two brothers plus three female friends, they were in their late teens, and they got together and they decided they just wanted to make a movie kind of mimicking what was made in Hollywood. Basically, they were just going to have fun. And a lot of Tarzan movies had been made, so they thought, well, let's just make another one. And they went to the woods in Granby, Connecticut, which is near his home in Hartford. They did all the shooting in a single day, and then Dad, using the equipment that Kim just described, edited into the film, the full film. As it turns out, there have actually been several sequels. This has had a sort of real strong effect on the history of filmmaking. He added the narration in 1993, and then in 1974, he did a little film called The Return of Tarzan, where some of the same people came back. So he and his two brothers were there. They even wore some of the same costumes. And then he made in 2005, he might have talked about it here, the making of Tarzan, the Rocky Gorge. And then I have to say, as I guess I'm a chip off the old block, I made one about Robin Hood and Royersford with my wife, Linda, who's over there. It was very much inspired and stylistically by the way Dad made his films, but we used a different hero. So I'd like to start by showing you the opening scene with his brother Paul.
Back in 1936, playing with a dog was a favorite pastime at the Barstow residence in Hartford, Connecticut. One afternoon, young Paul Barstow, while engaging in another of his favorite pastimes, reading about Tarzan of the Apes, suddenly was struck with a brilliant idea. Why not go to Africa and find Tarzan in person? So here we have Paulus Rufus Barstenio, the eminent African explorer, all rigged out and ready to start on this historic safari.
So one part of Dad's style was to use makeshift costumes and props.
He had enlisted 3 neighborhood friends to join him on this great adventure.
But perhaps more important than the costumes and props was that he enlisted willing participants, people who would put up with the gag and ham things up a little bit. Now, Dad knew that a good adventure film has a hero and a villain. So Paul, whom you just saw, was the hero, and Dad's other brother, John, was the villain, and you can see he also has a very nice costume. Now, this is one of the final scenes after the adventurers have successfully found Tarzan, and together they played around in the waters of around the Rocky Gorge.
But then, having shared these adventures with all of them, Tarzan had to say goodbye and take his departure. Diving off into 6 inches of water, he struggled upstream, and that was the last they saw of the great Tarzan in person.
So, as you can tell, this is a good example of Dad's rather wry sense of humor. He was aware that no one would confuse him with the real Tarzan, so he felt free to take liberties, like you just saw, of diving into 6 inches of water. We think of this film as one of Dad's blockbusters. It's been seen by more than 350,000 people on archive.org, and if you think in home movie terms, I think that qualifies as a blockbuster. And certainly one of the reasons that it's so popular, I think, is because it's unpretentious. Everybody was just playing around. They weren't taking themselves too seriously. The second film to talk about is one that Dad made in 1941. I think Dad talked about this back here in 2006. I watched it again last week, and I had forgotten an awful lot about the film except for the title, The Abba Dabba Kupno, which is really very hard to forget. The film, if you haven't seen it, it's a real gem. So find an opportunity to see it, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Dad was a pacifist during World War II and spent the summer of 1941 at a farm in New Jersey that was run by the American Friends Service Committee. So there were a bunch of interracial kids who were brought together with the idea of helping them to learn how to work together. And Dad has said that the kids were creative participants in this filmmaking process. It wasn't just like they were actors who were following Dad's direction. Dad used intertitles throughout the film. It was a silent film, and the titles often had a biblical or moral message. So that's the uncooperative kid. Now, obviously, the kid had a lot of anger issues. So a counselor came along to help him work through those issues. This counselor is a fellow named Bill Sutherland. Bill was strongly committed to nonviolence, as you can see by the way he lets the kid throw apples at him. After his time at the farm, Bill ended up spending 4 years in prison for draft resistance, and then became a prominent leader among African Americans in the civil rights movement. Now, back on the farm, Bill was able to help the kid who was no longer a Kupno. The titles for the film were an early example of Dad's use of trick shots. This is the title sequence. We're fast forwarding through the first part and then slow it down here at the end, where he makes it look like the letters are popping out of his hat. He did this by shooting the scene in reverse. Here's the forward version. And you can see that he's got the letters on a cloth and he just taps them so they fall into his hat. He also used reverse at the end, and what I'm going to do is show you first the forward version. He laid a string out to spell out the end, and then pulled the string this way to gradually undo it. And then when you reverse that, it looks like the string is spelling out the end. So this is the first film that we think of as being in Dad's collection. It's the first film I think that NYU has, and Kim's going to talk about another one.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, New York University acquired 4 of the films in 2008. It was the 16 millimeter reversal films that we acquired, along with DVD copies that Robbins Barstow had made, had produced himself with accompanying liner notes, and had also added voiceover narration to the DVDs. And that all happened in the 90s. The voiceover narration was added. And then the films came to us in 2008. So I referenced a little bit earlier how Robbins Barstow was associated with the Center for Home Movies, I believe we talked about, and then also the Orphan Film Symposium. He attended Orphans in 2008, and it was through that he decided to donate them to the university. Robbins had completed his master's at NYU, so the films were acquired as part of our New York University archives, which is the repository that collects manuscripts, papers, and films on the people of NYU and the place of NYU. So the idea to really donate these came about after Orphans, and we acquired the film that we talked about just now, the Abacadabra Kupno, which was preserved recently, as well as Youth in the Future. So Youth in the Future was produced with the Erie's Boys Club of the Hudson Guild Neighborhood Group. Youth in the Future is a dramatization of one of FDR's 4 freedoms. It's one of the few films that Barstow made in the 40s while living in New York City and attending graduate school at NYU. It's important to note that these films all promoted social activism, and he was very enmeshed with the students and the children as part of the Hudson Guild. So Barstow donated these films and also the Hudson Guild series. So one that we're going to get a chance to see today was just preserved. So we're going to have the premiere of this brand new preservation print that Joe, thank you, is preparing for us back there. And this is one of a couple films that Robbins made during his work with the Hudson Guild in the 1940s. So these are the 4 films that I've referenced a few times. We have the Abacadabra Kupno, Everyone's Coming to the Guild, the Hudson Guild Farm, and the last one, Youth in the Future, which I mentioned previously. We've been able to raise funds to preserve 3 of these 4 reversal prints, which were all suffering from pretty severe acetate deterioration, and we've prioritized this 4th to preserve next year as well. So we're in the process of making them available, and of course with the family's permission, would love to get them online to share them with you all as well. So an NYU alumnus, Robbins earned a master's degree in education and history in 1944, taking summer courses while employed as a social worker in New York. And we have had a chance to screen a few of these films as part of Orphan Film Symposium events and Amateur Cinema League Orphans events. As we mentioned, Robbins was a part of the ACL. So I think we can go ahead and roll the film now. I'm going to talk over it a little bit to give you all a bit more context. Everyone's Coming to the Guild is a portrait of a New York City neighborhood. This edited, narrative piece was shot in the spring of 1943 and is centered in Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood. The film was preserved by BB Optics, which coincidentally is headquartered in the very same neighborhood featured in this film. The film was preserved last year in 2018 at NYU libraries. In the early 1940s, Robbins Barstow was a newlywed, a conscientious objector to the war, and working in the Hudson Guild neighborhood house as a boys' group worker. Earning $25 a week, he lived in the neighborhood on West 28th Street with his wife, who served as the girls' group worker. Meg is later featured in the film, so stay tuned. The Hudson Guild was founded in 1871 and offered an array of social services to support the community, including vocational training, low-cost health care, educational enrichment, and even offered an environmental education program at a camp in New Jersey. The Hudson Guild also advocated for affordable housing for the predominantly first and second generation immigrant community. One of the Guild's major successes was its push for, and the city's approval of, low-cost, city-funded housing in Chelsea in 1938. In his role, Barstow was responsible for preparing after-school programs geared towards local youth, drawing on his educational training and social advocacy. Here, in the upper right-hand window, we see Meg pointing out the window. There she is. The film's innocent beginning, marked by a handwritten title card with the text, "Please, buddy, could you tell me where the Hudson Guild is?" reveals Barstow's close ties with individuals and his community. The camera is welcomed as an old friend, receiving waves and wide smiles from its subjects. The series of bodies, women, children, and young men outside the military draft age range, commit to providing eccentric directions to the Guild from where they stand. The fact that everyone can point to this place communicates its value to the community. The exploration of life in Chelsea produces an optimistic record, highlighting the value of community and benefits of local leadership. An unseen yet present force in the film is Dr. John Lovejoy Elliott, who founded the Hudson Guild and whose death in 1942, less than 1 year before, signaled the end of the first chapter of the Guild's history. Barstow situates the Hudson Guild as the physical and emotional epicenter in Chelsea, mere months after its founder's passing, showing, in literal black and white, the success from community-driven initiatives and an argument for a focus on home front concerns. Fittingly, the majority of footage in Everyone's Coming to the Guild is packed to the frame edge with Chelsea locals. Barstow invokes tropes common with amateur film: scripted interactions with self-conscious execution, unintentional breaking of the fourth wall, and passersby and children milling about the frame. Barstow lays out the emotional framework for Disneyland Dream, his 1956 film, by embracing the Hudson Guild, its members, and the Chelsea community as treasured elements of his life. He documents each interaction with care as if evidence of a fleeting sentiment in a specific time and place.
Yeah, narration was such an important part of Dad's craft that I really wish we had the narration for what we just saw. The next film that we'll talk about is Disneyland Dream. Back in 1956, when I was just almost 9 years old, our family won a contest for a free trip to Disneyland. Now, Disneyland had just been opened the previous year, and we were big Disney fans, and we really wanted to go to see it, but we lived in Connecticut across the country, so there was no hope for us until this contest came along. And Dad, true to form, recorded everything on his 16 millimeter film camera. This was one of the first times that he used color. And he produced this film, which lasts a little more than half an hour, and we family members, true to form, went along with it. It was the other film of Dad's that we think of as a blockbuster. It's been seen over 300,000 times on archive.org. And this is the film where Dad's craft really matured, and it shows how the pre-digital context influenced his work. First, he used color 16 millimeter film. And as Kim was describing, that meant there was only one copy of the film. You couldn't make more than one copy. There wasn't a negative, you just had that one copy. So that meant that you, or in our case, Dad, was always the one who showed the movie. The other thing is that 16 millimeter films were silent. You could not record sound with 16 millimeter cameras, and 16 millimeter projectors didn't project any sound. So the only way to get sound was to have it produced live while you were showing the film. This is kind of like they used to do with piano players in the old days of the silent Hollywood films. In our case, Dad would provide running commentary every time he showed the film. Now, the other thing that's important about Disneyland Dream was its premiere. It was on Labor Day in 1956, projected onto the white painted back of our house in Wethersfield to a gathering of neighbors. And this is from Dad's diary, and you can see that he says 90 people were there, which I think is pretty good for a family home movie. Now, all these neighbors came because they thought it would be fun. They didn't just watch the movie out of obligation, they actually enjoyed it. And Dad soon started getting requests from many people in our part of Connecticut who had heard about the film and wanted to see it. And he was happy to oblige, of course, showing the silent film with his projector accompanied by his narration. And this experience convinced Dad that home movies about family activities could be entertaining even for people who aren't in the family. Which, when we put these pieces together, silent films, one copy, entertainment, family stories, we get the heart of Dad's craft, to use narrated home movies to show and tell family stories that entertain and inform a wider audience than just the family. And the way he did it was he started with a story that was not inherently boring, and then he had willing actors who could ham it up. He used makeshift props and costumes like we saw in Tarzan, and special effects. He used special effects frequently, like the titling that he did in Abacadabra Kupno. And then you throw in a wry sense of humor, a great deal of enthusiasm, a genuine love for life, and occasional social commentary. So that's what Dad did, and that's how he did it. Here's a diagram of the process he used, based on the walkthrough that I did with him when I was trying to convince him to convert to digital. First, he shot all the raw footage, then had to wait several weeks for it to come back from the developers. And he carefully created scene notes, which were basically a time log of the footage. Then he created the storyline, deciding what to put in, what to throw away, basically creating a timeline of scenes for the story. And then he did the editing and wrote the narration, kind of in lockstep, based on the exact timing of the pieces that were spliced together. And then finally, he showed them the finished product to that live audience. In this case, it was the neighborhood film party on Labor Day. And you can see the effects of home movie constraints on this process. For example, it was several weeks between shooting the raw footage and getting the film back from the developer. So it wasn't like you'd shoot a phone and immediately shoot a film on your phone and immediately post it on Facebook. It didn't work like that. So in Dad's case, there was never an opportunity to do any reshooting. That means you had to think about the film enough ahead of time to shoot all the scenes that you wanted to have. And second, the splicing was destructive. When you splice these things together, you had to actually cut the film. So that meant you didn't get a chance to do it a second time. You had to get it right the first time, and that's why it was so important for him to plan the storyline so carefully and to make sure the narration lined up with exactly the length of the clips that were being spliced together. Now, in terms of raw footage, it's helpful to separate it into several categories. Live scenes are the scenes that are shot while your family is experiencing the story. In this case, it was when we were at Disneyland. There are extra scenes that you shoot, they're staged separately to help the flow of the story, and you'll see some examples of those in a minute. And then there are titles that are typically done with some sort of trickery in mind, like we saw in Abacadabra Kupno. So what I'd like to do now is to illustrate these elements with some clips from Disneyland Dream. The final film was about 34 minutes long, and most of it were of the live scene kinds of shots, shot while you're on the trip. But the introductory scenes, these extra scenes, it was actually a total of about 7 minutes, and they were shot before the trip. So even before we were on the trip, he kind of had an outline in mind of what he wanted the film to be like. Most of these scenes were shot after we knew we had won the contest. Dad wouldn't have wasted any money on a film about losing a contest. But in one case, the very opening scene, I'm not sure whether he shot it before or after we knew we had won. He had the contest stand that you can see there for a prop, and the store wouldn't have kept it after the contest was already over. So either Dad kept that stand with the hope that we would win, or somehow the storekeeper kept it for use later. Here we go. This is a scene that I am absolutely certain was reconstructed, because I was the one that made that castle, and it was a lot better. The one we made for the entry was a lot better than that thing you saw there. And I know that we didn't work on it all lined up carefully in order for him to cycle around. I also know that we didn't mail the entries by U.S. mail. The postman was another one of those willing participants, happy to go along with it. But according to Dad's notes, he used something called Railway Express. I don't know what Railway Express was, but it's probably something like FedEx or UPS or something like that. Now, as I mentioned, Dad kept a very detailed diary of his entire life. And here are the entries for May 6th, 1956, where it shows that we completed the work on the project. And on June 22nd was when we got a call from Western Union that said we won. Now, Dad reconstructed this by using the postman, but I know it wasn't the postman, because what happened that evening was I was going off to visit a friend down in the neighborhood somewhere, and I heard my mother shouting, "We won! We won! We won!" So I turned around and hurried on back.
This looked important, so the whole family gathered outside the front door. It was from the president of the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, and it read, "Congratulations on being one of the winners in the Scotch Brand Disneyland contest."
Now here's where Dad used some more trick shots. Slow motion fainting required a camera that could shoot slow motion. And also a family member willing to go along with it. So I know we put up with it a little grudgingly but good naturedly, and I am really impressed with my mother for being willing to do that.
We were one of 25 families.
Now this we skipped ahead a little bit, and this shows another one of his techniques, the reverse film. He loved to use that and used it a lot. He also liked to use the effect of making objects appear in the scene. That was Brother Dan, that was me, looked kind of grumpy, right? And that was Sister Mary. And this was an example of the kind of grudging family that would go along with it, because somewhere in there, Dad shouted, "David, smile!" And so then you saw the grin appear.
Meg had previously made for each member of the family a brightly colored Davy Crockett jacket, which we used on camping trips. We thought it'd be great to wear these jackets for our trip.
Now, Mother actually made costumes like that for us, for every one of our summer trips. And I'm wearing one right now. Now, Dad got the whole neighborhood to participate in staging the send-off. And again, the key was having willing participants. They were all very good-natured about it, and they enjoyed seeing themselves, of course, on Labor Day. Now, back in the 50s, home movies were still pretty rare, so it was very easy to get other people to go along with it, just like the neighbors you just saw, or like the pilot and stewardess.
We brought along our Scotch tape-made sign, and the pilot and stewardess were greatly interested in our being Disneyland contest winners.
Now, here's another trick.
Hotel in Pasadena, where we were booked to spend the next 7 nights. We never stayed in a luxury hotel.
This is our limo that we drove the hotel in.
It turned out that we were the best.
And now count the number of people getting out of the back seat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. We didn't all fit in the back seat, but what he did was to shoot the film where you couldn't see the left side of the car. And so we just had a line of people walking through the car, and I've seen him use the same trick with as many as 8 people coming out of the back seat. And that manager is another example of a willing participant. We actually weren't greeted by the manager when we got there, I have to confess. We had a basket of fruit in the room, and that was nice. But then Dad talked the manager into restaging the scene as if he had welcomed us. Now, this might be Dad's most famous reverse sequence. It was shot at the hotel pool, and this is an example of his spontaneous creativity. There's no way that he scripted this scene before we won the contest or before we got to the hotel. But we went swimming in the pool. I'm sure he said to himself, hey, I can do a reverse motion on this one. He had that certain creative spark when he saw something that he could imagine.
You know, everything about this trip was magic. When we got tired of swimming in the pool, all we had to do was think about it, and we'd rise right up out of the water and back onto the diving board.
Now, this is a page from the ACL movie book, the Amateur Cinema League that Kim mentioned earlier. It's a guide to making better movies, and it shows the way to produce a reverse motion. You take the shot holding the camera upside down, and then you twist the film around and reverse order the film, and it turns out that when you do that and splice it in, it's as if the motion happened in reverse. So that's what Dad did at the pool in Huntington Sheraton. He shot each of us going into the pool twice, once holding the camera right side up and once holding the camera upside down. It's interesting that this picture actually does show someone diving in and out of a pool. So it's an outside chance that Dad's swimming pool shots were inspired by this diagram, but I know that he used the reverse motion trick earlier than 1940. Now, incidentally, this trick only works with 16 millimeter film, and that's because it has the holes for the sprockets on both sides. You can't do the flip reverse thing if you only have sprocket holes on one side of the film. So that's why if you're using 8 or Super 8, you can't do this way, use this trick to do reverse video. Also note that Dad did this in slow motion because his camera could record slow motion. And I'm sure he did that because he knew what it would look like to really emphasize the magical effect.
Mary made it look not only easy, but graceful as well.
And of course, you had to make the spliced film fit in nicely. So basically that meant that, in this case, Mary had to do a good job of lining herself up with about the way that she was going to appear when she undove out of the pool. And I thought she did a pretty good job. Now this is another famous trick shot using the stop motion.
Knowing that everything here is magic, Meg had brought all of our meals wrapped up in this little plastic case. So we all sat down on a bench and waited patiently while she took the lunch bag out of the case and carefully unfolded it. Careful now, don't anybody push. And sure enough, out of the bag, each of us took a nicely cooked cheeseburger and a carton of milk. So
The way you do this is you just stop shooting, change something, in this case put the food into the bag, and then start shooting again, but you have to be very careful to sort of line things up well so that it doesn't look like anything else has changed. Now, most of Dad's special effects depended on the camera, the characteristics of the camera of the film. So 16 millimeter, the camera had to have a button that could do slow motion. But there were some special effects, namely sound special effects, that you couldn't do with the camera because the camera was shooting silent film. So this is an example.
Hippopotamuses wriggling their ears in warning. As we were watching one pair opening their mouths, our guide suddenly yelled, "Look out! There's a big hippo right up ahead!" And he pulled out his gun and fired a shot right at him. And then he fired again, and another one at a crocodile over on the riverbank. Wow, what a close encounter that was.
So the way he did that was while he was doing the narration, he would just clap his hands. And so that became part of the process of showing the film. One more example of an effect that depends on the camera.
That young Danny was able to get in his last licks, and then we departed, forever grateful to Scotch brand cellophane tape for making all this possible for us.
So the fading at the end required a little dial on the camera that would restrict the amount of light that went into the lens. Nowadays, of course, with digital technology, we do all sorts of things like this with just a push of the button. But Dad had to work a little harder at it. Now, one more thing about Dad that Kim has already mentioned. He absolutely loved movies. As I think Kim's mentioned already, we had like a new book every year at the Oscars. And you can see this love of movies in Disneyland Dream when we took a tour of Hollywood.
But it was fun to pass by the famous Midtown intersection of Hollywood and Vine, and to look for movie stars walking along these streets. Then the bus drove us through the exclusive Beverly Hills area, where the homes of a number of glamorous movie stars were pointed out to us. The next house coming up here is the house that Gary Cooper lived opposite. I was on the wrong side of the bus to get a picture of Cooper's actual house.
He always wanted to see a celebrity. Now, the irony here is that there actually was a celebrity in the film. He didn't know about it until more than 50 years later. But as you can see on his diary, this is the entry from early January in 2009. A few days after Disneyland Dream was selected for the National Film Registry, Dad got an email from Steve Martin, the actor, comedian, musician. Steve was a great Disneyland fan, and he had heard about the film, and when he watched it, he realized that he was in it.
To the entranceway and follow our dream through this magic kingdom step by step.
That is Steve Martin. He recognized himself. He was a kid who sold programs. I mean, there were a whole bunch of kids that were 12 years old, all selling programs at Disneyland. He recognized himself because of the top hat. He had picked out wearing a top hat in order to be able to distinguish himself from all the other kids selling programs so that he would sell more of them. And this little scene is actually now recognized as Steve Martin's very first film appearance. And it was included in a tribute to Steve Martin by the American Film Institute a few years ago. And Linda and I were fortunate enough to be able to attend that ceremony. The movie ended with another trick shot of the words, "the end." Remember what he did in Abacadabra Coupno, where he had that string and he pulled the string out under his hat. This time he did it differently. He did it with frame-at-a-time animation, and once again it depended on the camera. And the camera had a little button you could push that would expose one frame. So he spent hours probably moving the tape a tiny little bit each time, pushing that button, then moving it again. And of course you had to make sure that the camera was really solid. I don't even think he had a tripod. So I think he just sort of propped up boxes and books and bricks and things to make sure the camera was really solid. And you can actually compare the two different sequences and see that his handwriting really didn't change very much. Dad did one other set of films about the camping trips that we went on every summer. After a few short trips in 1954 55 and after Disneyland in 56, our family spent the next 5 years visiting, going all over the 48 states. And it would have been the entire country, except that Alaska and Hawaii were added around 1960, which kind of messed up the original plan. And that was when I first learned the word contiguous. So every summer, Dad would edit and produce a film to show to the neighborhood on Labor Day. And then it occurred to him that there were two themes, one based on American history, it was the East, the Midwest, and the South, and the other on the national parks and wonderlands in the Northwest and the Southwest, and those were our 5 trips. And so we assembled those and put them together into a pair of films that he called Family Camping Through 48 States.
See the tremendous amount of traveling that we did do in those 5 summers.
And as always, these were intended to entertain and inform a wider audience. And ultimately, these films, parts of these films achieved probably the widest audience of anything, because Ken Burns chose 29 seconds out of these films to put into his 2009 PBS special, The National Parks, America's Best Idea. Dad kept shooting on film through the on 16 millimeter film through the 70s and 80s. And mostly it was about travels with my mother. He then switched to Super 8 in the mid 80s and switched to VHS at the beginning of the 90s. And so by the turn of the century, Dad's process had evolved to where he did all of his editing with tape. And he used the equipment here you can see at the Weathersfield Community Television Center and produced many films that were shown on the local station. And so he actually developed quite a local following. And that was when he started using the name Barstow Travel Adventure and created the opening sequence. And if you're wondering, that's Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto 1 in B-flat minor. But I think actually the most important thing about the editing that he did with VHS was that it gave him a way to permanently add the narration that was such a vital part of the 16 millimeter films that he had made during the first 5 decades of his home movie career. So now his legacy can live on even when he is no longer around to narrate the films live while they were being shown. Yep.
Thanks, Dave. At this point, I want to highlight a number of resources and ways for folks in the audience to see Robbins Barstow's films if you haven't seen them in their entirety before. First and foremost, I want to give a heartfelt thanks to the Center for Home Movies for first introducing Robbins to our community. And it was through a home movie day in 2003 in Boston, I believe Liz Coffey had once mentioned, that Robbins became connected to this world and that we are able to know about his work. So a special thanks to Dwight Swanson, but also Katie Trainer and Skip Elsheimer, who are all in the room today, for their support and really helping us get to know Robbins Barstow. A number of his films are available, the Barstow Travel Adventures, on the website for the Center for Home Movies, so you can check them out there. Additionally, we mentioned that the Library of Congress acquired a number of the 16 millimeter films back in 2008. Those have all been scanned and are available on an Internet Archive as well. And then the Amateur Cinema site, which of course many in the room are familiar with. It's a tremendous resource organized by the University of Calgary and Charles Tepperman. The Amateur Movie Database was developed to learn more about the world of amateur cinema, and it assembles information about amateur films, filmmakers, and clubs. Here, of course, is a screenshot of the page on Robbins Barstow. In preparing for this talk with you all tonight, Dave and I kind of, with Dwight, went back to think about the entire filmography for Robbins Barstow. So I know Charles will have some updates we can make at some point to this to make it a bit more comprehensive. When asked what he thought about the word amateur at the 2008 Orphan Film Symposium, Robbins Barstow reflected, quote, "Amateur means you don't have to be perfect." In another interview, Barstow noted, quote, "I have a strong sense of wanting some special events to be preserved for future recollection. I want to give certain presentations an afterlife, not just have them blossom once and be gone forever. My hope is that orphan films will outlive their creators." Robbins Barstow passed away in November of 2010. In December of 2011, a memorial bench was placed near the Wethersfield Cove in his honor.
Don't ever say it isn't magic, because we know it is.
We hope you've enjoyed this Barstow Travel Adventure film. We'll be releasing more of Robbins Barstow's home movies on this YouTube channel during 2021. Click here to subscribe and receive the latest updates. Meanwhile, enjoy these other films by a master of home movie storytelling in the pre-digital era.